Every morning, roughly 750,000 people walk through the doors of Grand Central Terminal in New York City. They tilt their heads back at that impossible ceiling, cerulean blue, constellations painted in gold leaf, light pouring through arched windows the height of a 12-story building. They photograph the clock above the information booth. They feel, almost involuntarily, that they are standing inside something that was built for them, a gift from a civilization at its best. But Grand Central Terminal was not built by civic pride, or public vision, or democratic ambition. It was built because one man spent 60 years cornering every market he touched. And the building you are standing in is the final monument to that obsession. Well, here's the detail that never makes the tour. Cornelius Vanderbilt never held a single engineering credential, never designed a single mile of track, never drove a single spike. And yet, through stock manipulation and legislative bribery documented in the New York Times as early as 1867, he legally controlled more railroad miles than any individual in American history. The clock overhead was installed to celebrate his family's mastery of time itself. Time, as it turned out, was the one thing he could not buy. Now we begin at the water. Staten Island, 1810. The harbor smells of salt and rotting rope and horse manure from the docks. A 16-year-old boy named Cornelius Vanderbilt has borrowed $100 from his mother, Phoebe Hand Vanderbilt, a loan documented in family correspondence and referenced in New York State ferry licensing records from 1811, and used it to purchase a Patriarchal, a flat-bottomed two-masted sailing ferry common to New York Harbor at the time. He is not yet the commodore. He is not yet anything. He is a large, physically intimidating teenager from a working-class Dutch family on Staten Island, and he has decided, with a clarity that would define the next 7 decades of his life, that he is going to control the water between Staten Island and Manhattan. The myth that formed around this moment is one of the most durable in American business history. Vanderbilt is held up as the archetypal self-made man, grit over privilege, hustle over inheritance, the boy who started with one boat and built an empire. And there is truth in that framing, up to a point. He did borrow the money. He did work the ferry himself in the early years, hauling passengers and freight across the harbor in all weather. He was, by documented account, exceptionally good at it. Punctual, reliable, relentlessly attentive to schedule. New York State issued him his ferry license, and within 2 years, he had enough revenue to repay his mother and begin expanding. But here's the part the myth leaves out. Vanderbilt did not build his early empire through superior service alone. He built it through a method so deliberate and so ruthless that it would take historians decades to name it properly. When a competitor operated a ferry route he wanted, Vanderbilt did not simply try to outcompete them on quality or price. He undercut them to zero. He would slash his fares below operating cost, below the price of the coal and the crew, and sustain those losses personally until his competitors either surrendered their routes or went bankrupt. Then, once the competition was gone, he raised prices. Every time, without exception. On paper, passengers loved him. Cheaper fares, more reliable service. A man who seemed to genuinely despise the idea of charging more than necessary. In reality, he was teaching himself the mechanics of market strangulation, and he was extraordinarily talented at it. By the time he was in his 30s, Vanderbilt had forced several Hudson River steamboat operators out of business entirely using this exact method. A few tried to buy him off, paying him a retainer fee, essentially a bribe, to stay off their routes. He took the money, then he moved to a different route and started over. By the time he was 40, Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled the dominant steamboat lanes along the Hudson River. He had never held a government position, never received a land grant, never benefited from the kind of federal subsidy that would later underwrite the transcontinental railroads. What he had was a system, monopoly by attrition, and the will to apply it without sentiment or hesitation. There is no clock in this chapter yet, no station, no concourse, no gilded ceiling, but the mechanism is already running. Vanderbilt's obsession with scheduling, with being early, with holding others to an exact standard of timeliness, was noted by contemporaries even in his ferry days. A boat that left late was a boat he personally investigated. A crew member who cost him a departure was a crew member he did not rehire. Time, for Vanderbilt, was not an abstraction. It was leverage. Control the schedule, and you controlled the passenger. Control the passenger, and you controlled the route. Control the route, and you controlled the money. He hadn't touched a railroad yet, but the same method, the same instinct to compress, corner, and control, was about to find a much larger machine to inhabit. What happens next is a story about revenge that accidentally became an empire. New York City, 1862. Vanderbilt is 68 years old, absurdly wealthy by any standard of the era, and increasingly interested in a new kind of transportation that has been quietly reshaping the American interior for 30 years. Railroads. He has watched them from a distance, occasionally invested, occasionally maneuvered, but he has not yet committed to them the way he committed to the water. That changes in 1862 when he begins quietly acquiring stock in the New York and Harlem Railroad, a small but strategically critical line running from Lower Manhattan up through the city toward the Hudson Valley. The individual who enters the picture here, and who will shadow Vanderbilt for the next decade, is Daniel Drew, a former cattle drover turned Wall Street speculator whose financial instincts were, if anything, even less burdened by ethics than Vanderbilt's own. Drew was already a significant presence in New York financial circles, known for his willingness to manipulate stock prices with a ruthlessness that even his contemporaries found unsettling. He and Vanderbilt had history, years of maneuvering around each other in the steamboat era, and the relationship between them was never friendship. It was mutual surveillance. The New York and Harlem Railroad stock manipulation of 1863 is documented in the railroad's own stock ledgers and in the subsequent legal and legislative investigations that followed. The scheme worked like this. In a group of New York City aldermen, members of the city's Common Council, quietly agreed to grant the Harlem Railroad a lucrative new streetcar franchise that would significantly increase the railroad's value. Before the vote, they shorted Harlem stock, betting it would fall. Then they planned to vote the franchise down, pocket their short-selling profits, and walk away clean. What they failed to account for was Vanderbilt. He was watching the ledgers. He saw the short positions accumulating. And instead of selling, he bought. He bought everything. He absorbed every share being offered and kept buying until he had cornered the market, until the short sellers, the aldermen included, had nowhere to go. When the franchise was voted down, Harlem stock did fall briefly. And then Vanderbilt's corner held. And with the short sellers had to cover their positions, buying back stock from Vanderbilt at whatever price he chose to set. The aldermen who thought they were robbing him ended up paying him instead. He didn't enter railroads to build something. He entered to punish someone. And he stayed because the money was unlike anything even he had seen before. The New York and Harlem Railroad was now his. He wasted no time. He standardized the schedules. He imposed his own timetables on the platforms, reportedly overriding the railroad's official printed schedules with his own posted notices. A small detail, but a telling one. The station clocks were not decorative. They were instruments of authority. If the train left when Vanderbilt said it left, then the railroad operated on Vanderbilt's time. Everything else followed from that. The consequence of the Harlem corner was not merely financial. It established a behavioral template that Vanderbilt would follow for the rest of his life, and that his competitors would study with increasing alarm. You could not out-trade him on the open market. You could not wait him out. And if you tried to trap him, he would absorb the trap and turn it back on you with interest. By 1863, the word was out in New York financial circles. Vanderbilt was not a man to short. One railroad was not enough. The network logic of the Northeast demanded more. Every line connected to another. Every connection was a choke point waiting to be owned. The Hudson River Railroad sat adjacent to the Harlem line, and Vanderbilt's attention was already moving toward it before the ink was dry on the Harlem settlement. One line, then the next, until the whole corridor was his. The only question was how much it would cost everyone else. Now we arrive at Albany, and the price of a legislature. 1869. The consolidation of the New York Central Railroad is not a story about engineering or infrastructure or the bold vision of a man who wanted to connect America. It is a story about money changing hands in rooms where the public was not invited, and about the gap between what legislators said in the record and what investigators later found in the margins. By this point, Vanderbilt already controlled the New York and Harlem Railroad and the Hudson River Railroad. The New York Central, the main trunk line connecting Albany to Buffalo, and through connecting roads to Chicago, was the logical next piece. It was also the most valuable single rail property in the northeastern United States. And acquiring it meant persuading the New York State Legislature to authorize a merger that would give one man effective control of the primary passenger and freight corridor between New York City and the American interior. Vanderbilt's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, appears in the record here as a more cautious, more administratively minded partner, already being groomed to inherit an operation that was becoming too large for any single personality to manage through force of will alone. William Henry would spend years trying to make the empire manageable. He largely failed, but that comes later. The legislative record of 1869 documents a consolidation bill that passed with a smoothness that struck several contemporaries as suspicious. And bribery allegations against Vanderbilt's Albany lobbyists were not whispered, they were printed. The documented estimates of what the consolidation required in payments to sympathetic legislators vary. But the historian T.J. Stiles, in his Pulitzer-winning biography The First Tycoon, places the figure in the range of $500,000 in 1869 currency, a sum that translated to current values would represent tens of millions of dollars. Vanderbilt himself, when pressed on the subject in later years, was reported to have offered a response that became one of the most quoted lines of the Gilded Age. "It don't pay to bribe men," he reportedly said. He did not say he hadn't done it. The merger was approved. The New York Central was his. The immediate financial consequence was exactly what Vanderbilt's critics feared, and his allies expected. New York Central stock was inflated. The family's combined wealth doubled in a period that could be measured in months, not years. Competitors who had operated along parallel corridors found themselves squeezed, their freight customers moving to Vanderbilt's line, their passenger revenue following. The Northeastern Rail Corridor from New York City to Chicago now operated on a single set of terms, Vanderbilt's terms. And now, for the first time, the empire needed a monument, not just a functioning railroad, a symbol, something at the center of everything, in the most visible possible location, that said, "This is what the future looks like." And one man built it. He commissioned plans for a new passenger terminal at 42nd Street in Manhattan. The architect selected was John B. Snook, and the project was called the Grand Central Depot. The year was 1869. The clock concept, a station clock as a centerpiece, a literal embodiment of Vanderbilt's command over schedules, over time, over the movement of people through space, entered the blueprint early. Newspapers, when the plans were announced, praised the vision. One described it as a monument to American industrial progress. Another called it the finest railroad terminal on the continent before the first stone had been placed. The legislature had called the consolidation a public benefit. The receipts told a different story, and the building that was about to rise at 42nd Street, its iron roof, why, its compressed construction schedule, its borrowed money, would tell a different story too. But that would take a few more years to become visible. The empire was real now. The question was what it would cost to keep it standing. Continuing seamlessly from Part 1. Now we turn to the building itself. 42nd Street, Manhattan, 1869. The ground is frozen in November when the first survey stakes go into the earth. The neighborhood at this latitude is not yet the midtown of the 20th century. It is semi-industrial, semi-residential, a transitional zone that Vanderbilt's engineers have selected not for its elegance, but for its geometry. 3 railroad lines converge here. The logic is purely operational. Get the trains underground, get the passengers onto the street, and build something large enough that no one questions whether the man who owns it also owns the city. The architect is John B. Snook, a prolific New York commercial designer whose previous work includes the original A.T. Ian Stewart department store on Broadway, a building that understood the theater of commerce, the importance of making money feel like beauty. Snook is paired with engineer Isaac Buckhout, and together they are handed a commission that is, by any measure of the era, extraordinary. A terminal spanning the width of a full city block. A train, shed roof in iron and glass, vaulting 200 feet across the track space below. A facade of red brick and iron that would announce from blocks away that you were approaching something significant. The original construction contracts from 1869 survive in institutional records, and what they reveal, when read against the timeline, is a project under sustained pressure from the moment ground broke. Vanderbilt wanted the terminal operational by 1871. That was not a suggestion. The budget compression orders that came from Vanderbilt's office are documented, not as dramatic ultimatums, but as the steady, grinding pressure of a man who had spent 60 years treating deadlines as moral obligations and cost overruns as personal insults. Buckhout's internal engineering notes, referenced in subsequent structural analyses of the depot, flagged a specific concern about the train shed roof. The iron and glass vault was ambitious by any standard of contemporary engineering. The lateral bracing, according to Buckhout's own calculations, was insufficient relative to the snow and wind load data that engineers of the period already had access to. This was not a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of priority. The roof was designed to a schedule, not to a safety margin. The Grand Central Depot opened on October 10, 1871. The press coverage was exactly what Vanderbilt's office would have hoped for. The New York Times described the train shed as magnificent. Visitors reported standing beneath the glass and iron vault and feeling something close to awe. The particular sensation of a ceiling so high and a space so wide that the ordinary human sense of scale simply stops functioning. The clock installed above the main entrance was a simpler instrument than what would later replace it, but newspapers noted it specifically. It was described in the language of the era as a symbol of the precision and reliability that the New York Central Railroad promised its passengers. On paper, it was a triumph. A monument completed on schedule, under budget relative to comparable European terminals. A proof that American industrial ambition could produce something genuinely beautiful. In reality, the train shed roof was already under stress. Within 15 years of opening, the structure required major unplanned reinforcement. Additional iron members bolted into place to provide the lateral support that Buckhout's original design had sacrificed for speed. The reinforcement work was done quietly, no press release, No public acknowledgement that the roof everyone had praised as a marvel had been built to a deadline, rather than an engineering standard. The fix worked, technically. The shed stood. But it was eventually torn down entirely when the terminal was rebuilt in the 1900s. Not because it was outdated, but because it was, at its structural core, not what it had been presented as. The clock above the entrance kept running through all of it. The trains ran on time. The passengers never knew the difference. That was, by now, a pattern. Something far more dangerous than a stressed roof was accumulating underneath the tracks. But the full cost of that would take another 3 decades to surface. What follows is a report nobody wanted read aloud. Wall Street, 1868 and 1869. The trading floors smell of cigar smoke and paper, and the particular anxiety of men watching numbers move faster than they can fully process. Vanderbilt is in his mid-70s now, an age at which most men of the era are either dead or retired, and he is operating with a financial fluency that has only sharpened with age. He has a railroad empire. He needs to capitalize it. And the method he chooses is one of the most instructive examples of legal financial manipulation in American history. The practice is called stock watering. The term itself comes from the cattle trade, the old drover's trick of feeding cattle salt before a sale to make them drink heavily, increasing their weight and therefore their market price just before the buyer's assessment. You inflate the value of the product before anyone can verify what it's actually worth. Daniel Drew, of all people, is often credited with bringing the practice to Wall Street. The irony of Vanderbilt, Drew's sworn enemy, using the same technique at a far grander scale, is one the documentary record captures without comment. Here is what actually happened. When Vanderbilt consolidated the New York Central in 1869, he issued $80 million in new stock. The actual assessed value of the railroad's physical assets, the tracks, the rolling stock, the stations, the land, was approximately $50 million by the most generous contemporary estimates. Charles Francis Adams, Jr., whose 1873 investigation Railroads, Their Origin and Problems, remains one of the most rigorous early analyses of Gilded Age railroad finance, documented the disparity with the calm precision of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Vanderbilt and his insiders received shares at the inflated valuation. Later investors who bought on the open market paid inflated prices for assets worth substantially less. No law was broken, that was the point. The financial regulations of the 1860s did not prohibit the issuance of stock beyond asset value. Vanderbilt had not stolen anything. He had changed what the numbers meant, redefined the relationship between a railroad's paper value and its physical reality, and then sold the paper to people who had no way to verify the gap. He didn't steal the money. He changed what the money meant. The consequence was not immediate, and it was not contained. The inflated capitalization of the New York Central and other major railroads was one of the structural conditions that contributed to the Panic of 1873, the catastrophic financial contraction that threw hundreds of thousands of American workers out of employment, collapsed dozens of banks, and triggered a depression that lasted, by most economic measures, until 1879. Vanderbilt survived the panic relatively intact, as men of his specific financial position tended to do. The investors who had bought New York Central stock at inflated prices did not fare as well, and Jay Gould was watching. Gould, younger, sharper in certain financial respects, utterly without Vanderbilt's physical intimidation or personal charisma, had been studying the old man's methods since the early 1860s. He understood stock watering. He understood legislative manipulation. He understood that the real frontier of American railroad finance was not the track or the locomotive, but the capitalization table. Gould took everything Vanderbilt had demonstrated and removed the last remaining constraints. He would become the most feared financial operator of the Gilded Age, and Vanderbilt had written his curriculum. The clock above the depot entrance kept time without irony. Transactions were recorded in ledger books that balanced perfectly because the numbers inside them had been arranged to balance. The trains ran, the dividends paid. The gap between the paper and the physical reality widened, quietly, beneath the surface of everything. Gould was not finished learning, and Vanderbilt was about to discover that his own methods, turned against him, were more powerful than he had anticipated. Now we come to the fight that broke him. New York City and the New Jersey waterfront, 1868. This is the Erie War, a term that appears in the financial press almost immediately after the events it describes, because what happened was so operationally audacious and so legally chaotic that it required a name to contain it. It is remembered in the popular history of the Gilded Age as a colorful duel between titans. The documented record is considerably less romantic. Vanderbilt wants the Erie Railroad. The Erie runs across southern New York State to the Great Lakes, and it represents the one major northeastern trunk line he does not yet control. Without it, a competitor can always undercut his freight rates between New York and the interior. With it, the corridor is sealed. The logic is, by this point in his career, completely automatic. He begins buying Erie stock in late 1867. The Erie Ring, Jay Gould, Jim Fisk, and Daniel Drew, who is now operating firmly in the enemy camp, sees him coming. What they do next is documented in the New York Times coverage of March and April 1868. In the court injunctions filed across multiple jurisdictions, and in the subsequent legislative record of the New York State Assembly. It is one of the most precisely documented frauds in American financial history, which makes it all the more remarkable that its perpetrators faced essentially no legal consequence. The scheme was straightforward in concept and breathtaking in execution. As Vanderbilt bought Erie shares on the open market, the Ring simply printed more. They issued fraudulent convertible bonds and converted them to stock certificates and fed the new shares into the market faster than Vanderbilt could absorb them. Every dollar he spent buying Erie, they responded by creating new Erie shares to sell him. The stock certificates were, by any definition available at the time, fraudulent. They had been issued without proper board authorization, in violation of the railroad's own charter, and in direct defiance of a court injunction obtained by Vanderbilt's lawyers. Gould and Fisk, accompanied by roughly $6 million in cash stuffed into bags and trunks, fled across the Hudson River to the Taylor Hotel in Jersey City, New Jersey, outside the jurisdiction of the New York courts, where Vanderbilt held his injunctions. The New York Times reported their departure with a combination of outrage and barely suppressed disbelief. They sat in New Jersey, in what the press immediately dubbed Fort Taylor, and waited. Then Gould went to Albany. He arrived with a satchel containing, by the estimates of contemporaries, somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in cash, and he proceeded to purchase the retroactive legalization of the fraud he had just committed. The New York State Legislature passed a bill legalizing the Erie stock issuance. Vanderbilt's corner was broken. He had spent between $1 and $7 million. The estimates in the historical record vary, acquiring shares of a railroad he would never control, at prices inflated by certificates that had been manufactured specifically to defeat him. He withdrew. For the first time in a market engagement, Cornelius Vanderbilt walked away from a fight he had not won. Though he retreated to the lines he already controlled and did not pursue Erie again. The man who had never lost a market war walked away from this one, because the other side had simply bought the law. The Erie Railroad spent the next several decades in varying states of financial dysfunction, looted and mismanaged by a succession of operators for whom it was an instrument of speculation rather than a transportation system. Gould, moved on to larger targets. Vanderbilt's reputation, which had been largely untouchable in New York financial circles, took its first visible public crack. Newspapers that had praised him as a builder and an innovator began, cautiously, to question whether the empire he had assembled was the product of genius or simply the application of unlimited capital against opponents who couldn't sustain the attrition. His son William Henry was watching all of it, and William Henry was afraid. If you've made it this far, drop a comment below. Did you know any of this before today? The answer might surprise you. Next comes a reckoning that the ledgers tried to hide. The New York Central's rail yards, construction sites, and maintenance shops stretching across the northeastern United States through the 1860s and 70s. The smell of coal smoke and machine oil, the sound of hammers on cold iron, the particular exhaustion of men who work 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and are fined for arriving late to jobs that do not pay enough to cover a family's winter coal. This is the infrastructure of the empire. Not the stock ledgers, not the legislative chambers, and not the gilded interior of the depot on 42nd Street, but the physical reality of what it takes to run a railroad at scale in the 1870s. Vanderbilt's workers are almost entirely absent from the public mythology surrounding him. The histories that celebrate his vision and his financial acumen devote very little space to the men who actually built and maintained the network he owned. The congressional testimony from the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 fills some of that absence, and what it documents is not complicated. It is simply the arithmetic of a system in which the surplus flows upward and the risk flows down. In the summer of 1877, the New York Central reduced wages by 10% across its workforce. The reduction applied to engineers, firemen, brakemen, and DN shop workers. The men who operated the trains maintained the equipment and kept the physical infrastructure functioning. The wage cut was not an emergency measure. The New York Central had declared a dividend of $8 per share for the year. The money existed. The decision to cut wages while paying full dividends was a choice, made deliberately, by management that understood exactly what the arithmetic communicated. Workers at the West Albany shops and at yards across the system walked out. They were not alone. The summer of 1877 saw strikes spread across virtually every major American railroad simultaneously. The Baltimore and Ohio, the Pennsylvania, the Erie, in what became the first national labor action in American history. In Pittsburgh, the violence was severe. The Pennsylvania National Guard opened fire on strikers and bystanders. Over 20 people were killed. Rail yards burned. The documented death toll from the strike, taken across all railroads in all states, runs into the dozens. On the New York Central, the strike was suppressed with the deployment of the National Guard. The wage cuts were maintained. Vanderbilt, who was by this point in the final months of his life, he would die in January of 1878, reportedly described the striking workers as communists. The quote is documented in multiple contemporary accounts, and it captures, with a precision that no editorial comment could improve, the distance between the man at the top of the system and the men whose labor made the system function. Like he paid his shareholders $8 a share the same month he cut the men laying his track. The consequence of the strike was not the reversal of the wage cuts. It was the acceleration of labor organizing across the American railroad industry. The slow, painful, decades-long process by which workers in the most dangerous industrial occupation in the country began to build the institutional structures that would eventually give them some leverage against the men who owned the lines. That process would take 50 years and cost many more lives before it produced anything resembling stability. The depot on 42nd Street kept its clock running. The posted rules for New York Central employees documented in the railroad's operational circulars of the period included fines for tardiness. Workers who arrived late to shifts paid a financial penalty. The man who owned the clock also owned the penalty for failing to honor it. The building got more beautiful. The cost of maintaining it got more invisible. That gap between the polished surface of the institution and the human machinery underneath it would only widen as the decades passed. What follows is the moment the empire became a question. 10 Washington Place, New York City, January 4th, 1877. The house is quiet with the particular silence of rooms where someone has recently stopped breathing. Cornelius Vanderbilt is dead at 82, and the largest private fortune in American history, estimated at $100 million at the time of his death, a figure that in relative terms dwarfs the wealth of almost any individual before or since, is about to pass through the New York surrogate's court and into the hands of his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. The will itself, probated in January of 1877, is one of the most instructive documents in the history of American wealth concentration. William Henry receives approximately $90 million, the overwhelming bulk of the estate, including controlling interest in the New York Central Railroad. The 8 daughters receive $500,000 each. Cornelius Jeremiah Vanderbilt, the eldest son's younger brother, a man who had struggled throughout his adult life with mental illness and chronic debt, receives a trust structured to prevent him from accessing the principal. The disparity is not subtle. The daughters' combined inheritance amounts to $4 million against William Henry's $90 million. The will contest that followed, documented extensively in the surrogate's court filings, brought by several of the daughters and by Cornelius Jeremiah, was settled out of court. But the terms of the settlement and the bitterness documented in the legal filings make clear that this was not a family at peace with its patriarch's final decisions. The lawyers on record include Horace Russell, who represented the estate, and Clinton Bell, who represented contesting heirs. The contest produced testimony and documentation that, read today, reveals a family in which affection and financial calculation had been so thoroughly intertwined for so long that it had become impossible to separate them. Cornelius Vanderbilt had spent his life using money as leverage over everyone around him, including his children. The will was the final application of that principle. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited the largest fortune in American history, and his first instinct was to reduce his exposure as quickly as legally possible. And within 2 years, he had unloaded approximately $30 million in New York Central stock in a single transaction, one of the largest individual stock sales in the history of Wall Street to that point. The market absorbed it, barely. The sale temporarily destabilized New York Central's share price and confirmed what many in the financial community had suspected, that William Henry regarded the railroad empire not as a legacy to be extended, but as a liability to be managed. In an 1882 interview with the Chicago Daily News, William Henry Vanderbilt, pressed on the subject of the railroad's responsibilities to the traveling public, is reported to have said, "The public be damned." The quote has been disputed. William Henry later claimed he was misquoted or misunderstood. But the Chicago Daily News reporter, Clarence Dresser, stood by his account, and the line entered the historical record with the durability of a phrase that, whether perfectly accurate or slightly compressed, captures something essentially true about its subject. The Grand Central Depot on 42nd Street, the building his father had commissioned as a monument to the empire, was, by the time of Cornelius's death, already showing the limits of its original design. The tracks were congested. The platforms were inadequate for the volume of trains the New York Central was running. The train shed roof had been quietly reinforced once already. The building was not failing exactly. It was simply not equal to what the railroad had become. William Henry's estate inventory, filed after his own death in 1885, includes a notation for a personal clock kept at the family's Washington Place residence. Family tradition holds that the clock stopped at the hour of Cornelius Vanderbilt's death and was never restarted. No archival document confirms this with certainty, but the image persists. A stopped clock in a silent room, while the trains outside kept running on someone else's schedule. The depot was already obsolete. The plan to replace it would produce something magnificent and far more dangerous than anyone had fully anticipated. Continuing seamlessly from Part 2. Now we arrive at the disaster nobody was supposed to remember. Park Avenue Tunnel, Manhattan, January 8, 1902. It is a Wednesday morning, cold and gray. The tunnel filled with the accumulated smoke of 100 steam locomotives that have passed through it since dawn. The Park Avenue Tunnel runs beneath the street from Grand Central Depot at 42nd Street northward, carrying New York Central trains into and out of the terminal in both directions simultaneously, on tracks separated by a narrow island platform. The smoke is not incidental. It is the defining physical condition of the tunnel, thick enough on busy mornings to reduce visibility to a matter of feet. Signal lamps glow orange and red through the haze, but the haze swallows them before they carry far. And at 8 hours and 10 minutes in the morning, a New Haven Railroad Express train stops inside the tunnel near 56th Street, held at a signal. The train behind it, a New York Central Express operated by motorman John Whisker, runs the stop signal at speed and drives directly into the rear of the stationary train. The collision is not a glancing blow. It is full force, coach against coach, in a confined underground space already thick with smoke and reduced oxygen. 15 people are killed. More than 30 are injured. The dead include passengers who were reading morning newspapers, commuters who had made this exact journey dozens of times before, people for whom the Park Avenue Tunnel was simply the last underground minute before the city opened up above them. The New York Times ran the story on the front page on January 9th, 1902. The coroner's inquest that followed, and the Manhattan District Attorney's investigation, produced testimony that the New York Central's management would have preferred to keep out of the public record. The tunnel's visibility problem was not a surprise. It was not an unforeseen consequence of unusual weather or exceptional traffic. Complaints about smoke accumulation in the Park Avenue Tunnel had been filed with the New York Central's operating department for years before the crash. The complaints are documented. The responses, or rather the absence of responses, are documented. The railroad had received the information that its tunnel was dangerously obscured during peak operating hours, and it had made no structural changes. The rear train ran a stop signal. That is the proximate cause. And it is the cause that the New York Central's legal defense emphasized in every subsequent proceeding. John Whisker could not see the signal clearly. The question the inquest forced into the open was why Whisker could not see the signal clearly and what the railroad had known about that condition before 15 people died in the dark. No New York Central executive was criminally charged. The company faced civil liability and settled claims brought by the families of the dead. The railroad's criminal negligence investigation concluded without indictments, an outcome that the Times and several other papers noted with editorial displeasure, but which produced no further legal action. What the disaster did produce was legislation. Public outrage, channeled through the New York State Legislature, resulted in a mandate that all trains entering Manhattan below a specified point must be electrically powered. Steam locomotives, the source of the smoke, the cause of the visibility that had made the Park Avenue Tunnel a recurring hazard, were prohibited from operating in the underground approaches to the terminal. The deadline for compliance was set. The New York Central had no choice. The disaster that killed 15 people in a smoke-filled tunnel is the direct reason the building you walk through today exists. Grand Central Terminal, the soaring concourse, the celestial ceiling, the four-faced clock above the information booth, was not built because a railroad wanted to give New York something beautiful. It was built because a railroad had spent years ignoring a documented safety problem, and 15 people paid for that indifference with their lives. The crash happens in the dark, in a confined space, below a street with no clock and no concourse, and no gold leaf constellation. It is the precise inversion of everything the terminal would later promise: order, precision, mastery over time and space. And it is the foundation on which that promise was built. Chief Engineer William J. Wilgus was already thinking about what came next. His plan was extraordinary, but it contained a mechanism that the New York Central's board would eventually use in ways Wilgus had not fully anticipated. Next comes a plan that rewrote the city and erased the man who made it. The design and construction of Grand Central Terminal, 1903 through 1913. The smell of limestone dust and wet concrete, the sound of steam drills working through Manhattan schist 40 feet below street level, the particular atmosphere of a construction site so large that it becomes for a decade its own small city embedded inside the larger one. More than 10,000 workers pass through the site during the construction years. The project displaces an entire urban neighborhood. It reconfigures the street grid of Midtown Manhattan. It produces a building that will be photographed more times per year in the 21st century than almost any other interior space in the United States. The man who conceived it is named William J. Wilgus. He is the New York Central's chief engineer, and in December of 1902, less than a year after the Park Avenue Tunnel disaster, he submits a memorandum to the New York Central Board that is, by any measure of engineering vision, remarkable. The memorandum, which survives in institutional records, proposes not merely the electrification of the terminal approaches, but the complete reconstruction of the terminal itself. Tear out the old depot. Sink the tracks below grade on 2 levels. Cover the resulting real estate above the tracks and rent it to developers. Use the revenue from those air rights to finance the reconstruction. The terminal would, in effect, pay for itself by monetizing the space above it. The air rights concept was not entirely new, but Wilgus's application of it at this scale and in this location was genuinely original. It is the financial mechanism that makes Grand Central Terminal possible, and it is the mechanism that the New York Central would later use, in the hands of less scrupulous management, as a tool for real estate speculation that came close to destroying the building entirely. But that comes later. The architectural competition for the new terminal involved 2 firms, Reed and Stem, a St. Paul practice with serious railroad terminal experience, and Warren and Wetmore, a New York firm whose senior partner, Whitney Warren, had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and had a personal social relationship with William K. Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore. See, the 2 firms were eventually required to collaborate, an arrangement documented in the contractual record and in the lawsuit that followed. Charles Reed and Alan Stem had won the original design competition. Their scheme included the innovative ramp system that replaced staircases in the terminal's pedestrian circulation, a practical solution to the problem of moving enormous crowds through a multi-level building without bottlenecks. Whitney Warren's contribution was primarily aesthetic: the Beaux-Arts facade, the heroic scale of the main concourse, the celestial ceiling. The overlap between the 2 firms' contributions became, during construction, a source of escalating professional conflict. Reed and Stem filed suit against Warren and Wetmore in 1911, alleging that they had been systematically pushed out of the project and denied proper credit and compensation. The lawsuit was settled, partially in Reed and Stem's favor, in terms that the court record documents, but that the architectural history of the building has largely ignored. Whitney Warren's name dominates the historical narrative of Grand Central Terminal's design. Charles Reed, who died in 1911 before the terminal opened, and Alan Stem, who lived to see the building completed without his firm's name on it, occupy footnotes in accounts that Warren and his associates helped shape. The building everyone calls a masterpiece was also a real estate financing scheme, and the man who actually conceived it was quietly written out of the story before the doors opened. E. Wilgus himself was forced out of the New York Central in 1907, 6 years before the terminal's completion. The specific circumstances of his departure involve a dispute with management over cost overruns and project control. The details are documented in internal correspondence that historians have only partially reconstructed. He did not attend the opening in February of 1913. His name does not appear on the building. The four-faced opal clock was installed above the information booth in 1913. Opening day coverage in the New York papers described it as a symbol of permanence and mastery. The New York Central's promise that this building and the institution behind it would endure. The clock gleamed. The crowds moved beneath it. The financial structure underneath was already developing the first of its long cracks. Now we come to the war. New York, almost lost. New York City, 1961 through 1963. The post-war decades have not been kind to the American railroad. The automobile has taken the short-distance passenger. The airplane has taken the long-distance passenger. The interstate highway system, financed by federal dollars that flow freely to roads and almost nowhere to rails, is accelerating both trends simultaneously. The great railroad companies of the Gilded Age are contracting, consolidating, and in several cases quietly beginning the financial spiral that will end in bankruptcy. The New York Central, successor institution to everything Cornelius Vanderbilt assembled, is being run in 1961 by Alfred Perlman, a president whose primary obligation, as he understood it, and as the board that employed him understood it, was to the company's balance sheet rather than its architectural legacy. Grand Central Terminal is not, in Perlman's financial analysis, primarily a transportation hub. It is a piece of extraordinarily valuable Manhattan real estate sitting on top of an air right structure that William Wilgus designed specifically to be monetized. Pennsylvania Station, Penn Station, the other great New York Railroad terminal, built by the Pennsylvania Railroad between 1904 and 1910, a building of Roman imperial scale whose main waiting room was modeled on the baths of Caracalla, had already been sold to a developer named Irving Felt. The demolition began in 1963. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic of the New York Times, he wrote about the destruction with a controlled fury that remains among the most quoted pieces of architectural journalism in the 20th century. On October 30th, 1963, the Times published an editorial that included the line, "We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed." The wrecking cruise did not stop. Penn Station was gone by 1966. What replaced it was a building that no one has ever described as magnificent. The loss was immediate, visceral, and documented in photographs that showed the Pennsylvania Railroad's limestone columns lying in rubble in the meadowlands of New Jersey. The New York Central watched Penn Station's demolition and immediately began filing the paperwork to do the same to Grand Central. The air rights above the terminal, in the hands of a developer, would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The railroad needed the money. The logic was, from a strictly financial perspective, coherent. The terminal would come down, a tower would go up, and the trains, what remained of them, would run beneath it in a configuration to be determined later. What followed was a 16-year legal battle, documented in the records of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Established in 1965 as a direct legislative consequence of Penn Station's demolition, and ultimately resolved by the United States Supreme Court in Penn Central Transportation Company versus City of New York, Decided in 1978. Penn Central, the merged successor to the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Formed in 1968. Went bankrupt in 1970. It remains the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. The company that had been assembled from the ruins of Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire, the company whose predecessor had built Grand Central Terminal as a monument to permanence, filed for bankruptcy protection while its lawyers were simultaneously arguing in federal court that it had the right to demolish the terminal for profit. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, whose documented testimony before city and federal bodies in 1975 became the public face of the preservation campaign, framed the argument in terms that cut through the legal complexity with uncommon directness. She asked, essentially, Onassis out what it meant about a civilization that it would destroy what it had built at its best in order to replace it with what it could build at its most expedient. Grand Central Terminal was not saved because the railroad loved it. It was saved because the company trying to demolish it ran out of money and lawyers before the preservationists ran out of arguments. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the city's landmarks law. The terminal was legally protected. The clock above the information booth was still running. The building had survived. The question of who would get credit for that survival and who would be forgotten in the account was already being answered. Continuing seamlessly from Part 3, now we come to the part where the story gets rewritten. Grand Central Terminal's Centennial, 2013. The concourse is full of camera crews and civic speeches and carefully worded tributes to vision and permanence. The building has been restored. A $200 million renovation completed in 1998 returned the celestial ceiling to something close to its original color, stripped decades of accumulated grime from the limestone, and brought the four-faced opal clock above the information booth back to the gleaming condition it had held on opening day in 1913. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which now operates the terminal, has done what the Vanderbilt family and its corporate successors never quite managed, maintained the building as though it mattered. The biographical industry surrounding Cornelius Vanderbilt tells a version of this story that has shifted considerably over the decades. Wheaton J. Lane's 1942 biography presented Vanderbilt in terms that the subject himself would have approved. A builder, a visionary, a self-made titan whose force of personality shaped the industrial landscape of a nation. The stock manipulation, the legislative bribery, the labor suppression, the Erie War, the watered stock, present in the record, largely softened in the framing. T.J. Stiles's 2009 biography, The First Tycoon, won the Pulitzer Prize for biography and did something the earlier accounts had declined to do. It went to the primary sources, the congressional testimony, the court records, the stock ledgers, the strike documentation. What Stiles found was not a different man exactly, but a far more complete one. A man whose genuine operational brilliance was inseparable from his willingness to corrupt legislators, destroy competitors, and treat the workers who maintained his empire as a variable cost to be reduced whenever the dividend required it. The heroic narrative had not been built from nothing. It had been built by selecting carefully from a record that, read in full, told a considerably more complicated story. You can buy a legacy, but you have to buy it again every generation. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, Ian, endowed with a $1 million gift from Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1873, retains his name. It is a fine institution. Its business school teaches, among other things, the history of Gilded Age railroad finance, including, in certain courses, the stock manipulation practices of its founder, as cautionary examples of unregulated market behavior. The clock above the Grand Central Information Booth, restored by a public transit authority to the specifications of a building the Vanderbilt family's corporate successors tried to demolish, keeps time for 750,000 50,000 people a day. The motif has completed its first full turn, installed as a monument to one man's mastery, maintained now by the institution that replaced everything he built. And so we return to where we started, Grand Central Terminal, this morning. The light comes through the arched windows the same way it always has. Angled, golden, slightly theatrical, as though the building itself understands that it is being watched. The commuters move through the main concourse in the flowing, unconscious choreography of people who have made this journey so many times that the space has become invisible to them. The tourists stop. They look up. They photograph the clock. The four-faced opal clock above the information booth is valued at approximately $20 million. It was installed in 1913 as a literal symbol of the New York Central Railroad's permanence and mastery. The railroad no longer exists. The company that succeeded it went bankrupt in 1970. And the family whose patriarch commissioned the terminal's predecessor in 1869, whose fortune was, at its peak, the largest private accumulation of wealth in American history, dispersed that fortune across subsequent generations with a thoroughness that economists and historians have documented as one of the more complete examples of multi-generational wealth dissolution in the American record. The building remains. 15 people died in the Park Avenue Tunnel on January 8, 1902. Because the New York Central Railroad had received documented warnings about dangerous visibility conditions in its underground approaches and made no changes until the deaths forced a legislative mandate. Their names do not appear on any wall inside Grand Central Terminal. William Wilgus, the chief engineer who conceived the air rights financing mechanism that made the terminal possible, was forced out of the company 6 years before the building opened and did not attend the ceremony. Charles Reed, who won the architectural competition, died before the doors opened and watched his firm's contribution absorbed into a historical narrative, shaped by the partner who had better social connections. The workers who maintained the empire were fined for being late to jobs that paid less than the dividend checks sent to people who had never laid a hand on a rail. The clock still tells the right time. It just doesn't tell the whole story. 750,000 people pass through this building every day. They feel, almost without thinking, that they are standing inside a gift, something built for them, offered freely, a product of civic ambition and industrial grace. The building is beautiful. That part is true. The rest of it is buried deep enough, by now, that it has become invisible. He wanted to own every train in America. For a moment he did. The trains are gone. The clock remains. The morning light is still coming through those windows. It will come through tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as the building stands, which, given that it survived a 16-year legal battle against its own owner, may be a very long time indeed. The tourist will keep arriving. The commuters will keep moving. The clock will keep turning above the information booth, 4 faces pointing in 4 directions, marking time for people whose names will never appear in any history of the place they are passing through. Cornelius Vanderbilt borrowed $100 from his mother in 1810 and spent the next 67 years compressing, cornering, and controlling every market he touched. He died the richest man in America. His empire was sold, merged, mismanaged, and bankrupted within a century of his death. The building that bears his family's name in its origin story was saved not by the family, but by a preservation law that the family's own indifference made necessary. The clock he would have recognized as his. The symbol of his command over time, over schedule, over the movement of human beings through space, is now maintained by a public authority, cleaned by workers whose predecessors he would have fined for being late, photographed by tourists who know his name but not what it cost. The building outlasts everyone. That is the only thing in this story that was never in dispute.